Hi, so this is understanding my. Sorry.
Good.
We're good. Okay, this is understanding migration development in Drupal 8. Hopefully you're in the right room. The talk is going to cover some strategies and tools that I use and we use in our group to develop migrations. So there's probably going to be a lot of stuff, and none of it's going to go too deep. The intended audience are people that know a bit about Drupal 8 development, but not necessarily that much about migration. So we will cover some high-level topics, and then kind of talk about a lot of things that are involved in this sort of development process. I get a lot of value from sort of getting awareness from talks. So these slides are all available online on the session page. So if you want to look at any of the specifics, don't feel like you have to write it down or take pictures or anything. Some of the slides, some of the pages we'll go through a little bit quickly to just say, here's a thing, but the details of it, if you want to reference back later, you can kind of take a look. Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming, and we'll jump in. So again, my name's Dan Montgomery, and I'm a senior engineer and technical architect at Palantir.net. This is a picture of Palantir. We are I'm going to try to get this right for it. So we are a digital consultancy with a focus on higher education, government, and healthcare, with pretty much anything as well, but that's the focus. And there is currently job postings on the MidCamp site, so if you're interested, there's other sessions that we're having as well, and there's a booth out at the front. All right, so these are the topics that we're going to go over. At the beginning, we're going to cover a brief overview of sort of what is involved with migration. We'll talk about automated testing and using automated testing as a way of doing test-driven development in a sense. Talk about the process of actually building a migration, and then how to plan for manual content migration cleanup after you kind of do the automated work and you pass it on to content editors that are going to have to fill in the gaps. All right, so for the overview, the migrations are basically, then I might get some of this a little bit off from the official definitions, and Mike's here, so I'm a little bit nervous about it. But this is how I understand things. You basically have your source data, and you want to take that source data and create destination content or entities in the Drupal 8 site. And the migration is the process of doing that. So what does that look like? So your source, what we mean by source data, it could be a source database. Drupal 6 and 7 databases are very well supported. It could be a set of flat files or some combination of all these things. So YAML files, we're pretty used to dealing with in Drupal 8. You can use CSV files, JSON files, pretty much anything that you want. The destination sources that we're talking about, it's a pretty flexible system that we'll talk about, but primarily nodes, like if you're making articles or pages, translations of nodes, individual files, how they bundle up into media files or media entities. It could be custom modules that provide their own entities like paragraphs, or if you create your own entities as well that extend certain classes, you can migrate into those. The migration that we're going to be talking about is primarily a custom migration module that you'll be developing, and then it'll be supported by core and contributed plugins, essentially, or like pieces from core and contrib, including Migrate Plus. We'll kind of assume that most of this is using Migrate Plus as well as the core Drupal Migrate module. And then for things like paragraphs, paragraphs comes with some of its own plugins. All right, so automated testing. The use case for this that we've done is creating tests first with example content, and then running those tests write the migration, keep running those tests until the tests pass. And at that point, you've kind of shown that with your example content, that exists in the new system exactly as you expected it. This can also be used to reduce regression. So if you're writing custom plugins within the system and you want to make sure that they're still working, those automated tests are really helpful to just kind of repeatedly run throughout the development process. Or maybe you've made some changes to content types and you want to kind of run it again. It can be pretty difficult to test content migration because of all the content pieces, and so having something to do that in an automated fashion can be really helpful. We use Behat as a testing framework. That's part of Drupal 8. Well, I don't know if it's part of Drupal 8, but it's a pretty common framework. There we use static source data, so maybe like a snapshot of a database that's from a given point in time that we know is going to be consistent. And then we test the data directly on the new site. So this isn't how it's being presented on the page, but just the actual data source. So one thing that's helpful with that is the open source Palantir Behat extension, which lets you look at the data directly. So we'll show some examples. So this is an example test. So this is a feature with a scenario, and the highlighted bits are the kind of the important parts here. So you can load example nodes of a specific type, so in this case an article node with a certain title, and then you can test field values against it. So this is really easy to write before you've even written the migration. It's not looking at specific, I mean it is looking at field names, but you can kind of fill those in as you go. And you can test that just sort of like the core value of that field is a specific thing. This can also work with paragraphs, so you can test for that a certain field has a type of paragraph, and you can also test that a certain field on a paragraph has certain values. So this can be really, you can kind of extend it as you need to handle different types of fields or different types of entities. All right, so that's how we kind of use the automated testing framework. When we're actually building the migrations to pass those tests, one of the processes that I go through is to kind of scaffold out the module just like I would kind of a lot of work. We'll look at what a completed migration looks like so that we know kind of what we're building towards. Explore a lot of the work is exploring the data, either the source or the destination data, and then making a map between that source and destination data. And then lastly, the migrations that have dependencies on other migrations, how do we kind of manage those relationships? So if there's articles that require media entities, like how do you make sure that those are all kind of being connected together correctly? Okay, so the migration module is going to be made up of mostly configuration files, just like a lot of Drupal code, and custom plugins. So the configuration files, most of them, for the configuration files, they're going to include a lot of content in them, but the core content that they're going to describe is the source, the destination, and then kind of how do we process each field so that we get the correct values in the destination from the correct values in the source. The plugins that we might develop are going to match up to those three parts of the process. So we might develop, we will either find or create our own source, destination, and process plugins. So if we have a special kind of file that's not supported or a special kind of database, you might create a source plugin. If you have a special kind of entity that you need handling for, you might create a destination one, and we'll cover some of the process stuff as well. So just like most modules, it's an info file. We can set up a folder where we're going to put all of our configuration files and a folder where we're going to put all our plugins. One thing that I will usually do is set up an uninstall hook so that because we're dealing with a lot of configuration, it's helpful to be able to uninstall that when you uninstall the module. And so just having a system for doing that automatically without, that's a common bottleneck that you might hit. You disable the module, enable it again to try to get the configuration back, and it gives you an error because there's a conflict, because the configuration already exists. So that can be helpful. You can also set up migration groups, and that's something I'll usually do before I even write the migrations. And this can kind of tie together shared configuration, including database configuration. So let's say you have a Drupal 7 database in your Drupal 8 environment. You can set up the connection details and settings.php, then create a configuration file that kind of links the two and defines a migration group. And then in each of your migration files, you can specify that it's part of that group and it'll inherit that connection. So a lot of that work is just kind of connected for you. All right, so that's kind of a lot. What does the actual migration look like? So these configurations files more or less look like this. So there's one file per migration. They've got an ID, they're part of that group if it makes sense. They might have dependencies, so for example, like if an article is dependent on a media file, we'll come back to that, but you might want to add that as a dependency. And then they have the same sort of destination, source, and process that we've been talking about a little bit. So the destination is the first thing that I'll usually add and figure out, like, what am I creating from this migration? So in this case, we're going to create a node. Where am I getting this data from? So the source in this case is a Drupal 7 node. So this ID D7 node is an ID for a plugin that's going to be able to read in intelligently a Drupal 7 node. And then the process step includes, this is the destination field, and then this is the source field. So how am I going to map the two together? So this is a very simple example where we have a title field in the destination and a title field in the source, and that's kind of all that's needed. If there's additional plugins that are being used, you specify that there's a plugin and then what the plugin's name is, and then the plugin usually has parameters that you pass in. This is a simple one where if you just want to set a value for everything, you can just use the default value plugin and just say that the type is always going to be article. All right, so this is more or less what we'll be creating, but like kind of how do you fill in all these values is what we'll talk through next. So the first thing, we're going to have to identify the destination. Like, what do I type in there? If possible, we want to copy some examples, and then we want to identify the source and figure out, like, where is this data coming from? I need to know what the ID is. So for all this, it's kind of the same thing. Like, Drupal 8 has this nice system of annotation, and it has this sort of structured method for its plugins. So a lot of these plugins that so for destinations, they're all going to be defined by classes in Drupal 8. And you can find a lot of these classes in the Drupal migrate module. You can also find a lot in other modules by looking in this common path source plugin migrate destination. So this stage is kind of like an exploratory phase. Like, you can either look online or you can just kind of look around in your code editor and try to find, like, what are my options for creating things? Do any of these make sense? Like, if I'm trying to migrate into a node, like, is there one that exists that's called node? Or if it's a paragraph, is it called paragraph? And then this at migrate destination annotation is another way that you can find, that'll be present in all of the classes that kind of define it. So once you've found a class that makes sense, or that might make sense, you'll look for this part of the annotation that says this is the ID for that, and this is the name that's used in those migration files. So the ID, so it'll say ID equals, in this case, URL alias. So if you're creating URL aliases, this is the one that you'd want to use. And you can find example migrations that might be in the code base where people have written, like, test migrations to say, like, okay, this is the source. So if we go back a couple pages and say, like, the plugin, in this case it would say URL alias, you might be able to find one that somebody has already written and use that as a starting point. So you might not always find ones that match 100%. So one thing that's important to be aware of is derivative classes. So they're very common, particularly because entities and entity revisions, like nodes, use this deriver class. So before we saw that it was, I think it was called entity node. And so in this case, we have this colon here, and that's indicating that the ID is actually entity, and then the parameter it's getting is node. So in this case, you're going to find an entity class, but you're not going to find one that's just called node, and you're not going to find one that's called article. All right, so that's something to be aware of. Once you do find that, you'll see, for example, entity or entity revision, and then the colon and the name. Okay. So once you do that, you can do a search for plugin, just like we saw before with the ID, and you'll probably find something that already exists. In this case, with the URL alias, there's something called D7 URL alias, and that's a good example of, like, how do you migrate URL aliases from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. And so that's going to be a really useful example to copy from. If you can't find one in there, you probably can find something online that has a good starting point. So the same process is what you'll do for identifying the source. So pretty much you need to find, this is what it looks like, and you're going to need to understand what the ID is. And the ID can be found in the same sort of places with the same annotations as the destination classes. All right, so once we kind of make that scaffolding, like, what's the process of running migration? So when we're developing migrations, we run them, and then we kind of rerun them repeatedly, like, as we add additional fields, as things are working and things are maybe not working. So a lot of this can be done pretty easily with Drush. There's a admin interface that you can use as well, but Drush has a lot of useful tools. So probably the most important one that here is Drush migrate import, or the short version is MIM. And then you can list the name of your migration, which was the ID that you defined, and it'll just run the whole thing. So that's pretty useful. If you need to rerun it, you could, because maybe you've updated the files, it's this configuration. An easy way to do that is to uninstall the module and then reinstall the module, and you'll get an update. If you don't do that, you can make changes, and it's not going to re-import your changes, so you won't see your migration get updated. Another way to do this is to use a contributed module called config.devel, which will provide an easier way of reloading that configuration. It has a screen where you can put in all the files that you want to reload, and then whenever you open the browser, it'll just reload them for you. So that goes a lot quicker than the other process. So that's one way to speed things up. You can also speed things up by limiting the data that you're migrating. So in this case, we talked about sample data. So some common parameters are doing things like specifying a list of source IDs. So you could say, I only want to import source 123 because that one has a lot of the fields, and I don't need to process all of them because that takes too long. You can also limit it in this case. This could be slow because the way it is faster than the alternative, but it can be slow because it reads through all of the source data fields until all of the source entities until it gets to that specific one. So there's actually a way that I will usually use, which is modifying the source plugin directly, either in a contrib module, which is probably not the best idea, or by making my own extended version of the plugin, and then adding a condition to say, as part of the query stage, I'm only going to ever query that one node, and then I just delete this line at the end. So that kind of speeds the whole thing up because the system's only ever aware of that one piece of content that I'm interested in, and the whole thing just runs very, very quickly. All right, so we kind of have, in this sense, like we know how to run migrations, we know like the overall structure, but before we can make that mapping, we need to really understand the destination and the source. So the ways that you can do that, you can open up the admin structure page and just kind of look at the content in your Drupal 8 site and start listing the fields. What are the fields? What are the field types that I need to create? Devel has a really nice way of having a tab. You can create an example piece of content, and then you can go look at that and see what's there. So this is an example of the Devel output, and you can see that there's a body field, and it has a value and a format. And the summary is sort of an optional field. So we know that if we're going to be migrating into this, this is basically the structure that we're going to need to create. So if Devel has a limitation that those tabs only show up on page-based content, so if you have pageless content like paragraphs, there is a tab if you want to use the browser. You can enable Devel and then PHP, and then you can just paste PHP in there, and you can start printing messages. So this is something that's useful for like paragraphs, where you're loading a specific entity in a specific paragraph, and it just prints it to the screen. So that's helpful. You don't need to install any extra tools except for Devel. Another option is you could, use, if it's a Drupal site, you could use those methods. If it's a non-Drupal site, you can't use those methods for the source. If you're exploring the source, you could use the same methods. They're available on Drupal 7 or Drupal 6, but they're not available for maybe a WordPress site or a CSV file. So a common pattern that we use is to use a debug process plugin. So creating process plugins is pretty simple. The key is that you provide an ID, you create a class, and then you have a transform method. And this takes in a value that it gets passed, and then you kind of do something to it and return a value. We're not really using it for that in this case. We're just printing to the screen or to the terminal whatever is the content of that value. So this can be used to say, hey, we're going to have a field name, and we're going to get this field that's called name, and then we're just going to print it. And so when you run that drush command, it's just going to print every value that it hits to the screen in sort of like a nice-ish format. And you can look at, what is the source data that I'm getting? What was the destination data? How can I match them? This is an option for it in that specific one that we created, where you could also just print what are all the values of the row. Instead of just the specific one, I want to know what the whole content looks like. So the third option is to use xdebug. So if you use xdebug as a debugger, this is a really good option that you can use with migration. Things to keep in mind are that you're going to need somewhere to put a breakpoint. So process plugins are a really good place for that. You can add that debug plugin, and then you can put a breakpoint in it. Because it's xdebug, one of the easier ways to trigger that is to run the migrations through the user interface. So mostly I run them through the console, but if you run it through the user interface, you can add that URL parameter, start up xdebug, and then trigger the migration, and it'll stop where you are, and you can look at the destination, you can look at the source, you can look at the values, kind of explore anything as you want, instead of kind of continually rerunning things. All right, so once we have an idea of the source and the destination, we need to kind of map the two. So the first thing I do in that process is say, here's all my destination fields. I'm going to just list them all in that configuration file. Once I've done that, I kind of look through the source data and then piece by piece map them up, refresh the page, run the migration again, and then just see if that's working. So like field by field, make sure each one's going. You can use that automated testing framework to do that a little bit quicker for you. And then just keep running that automated migration, and eventually it's going to say everything passed, and you have a pretty good idea that things are working. Yeah, so at this point, the key thing that you're going to be dealing with, because you've already identified the source and the destination, is process plugins. So just like source and destination plugins, process plugins can be found in the same way. And there's a lot of really good documentation online for that. So here are some links to Drupal.org. They'll define every single version of the process plugins that you can use, examples of how those can be used, what the parameters are, things like that. If you write a custom one, that could be, if you're not finding something that's working for you or it's becoming way too complicated, custom process plugins are not that hard to write. And you have access to things like the value that you're being passed in, and also the whole source row. So if you need to combine multiple source rows into a specific value, that might be a way that you can do it. There are ways that you can kind of combine existing process plugins, but if you're struggling with that, it might be worth trying a custom process plugin. All right, so yeah, the last topic, or sorry, second to last topic, is managing relationships. So let's say you've got your migration completed and you've written the node migration, and it needs those media entities to exist. So there's kind of like two main ways that you can go about doing this. You can either specify them all as dependencies and say that I need to run them in a specific order. So I need to run that media migration first, so that when the node migration is running and those references exist, it can find the other entities and it can recreate those references. That's definitely a valid option. There are some limitations. Another option is to say, I'm going to run them in any order, and I'm going to use this stub process. So when you write those references, you can say, if it doesn't exist, just create a stub, and it's an empty version of that with just an ID. And then when it, let's say you wrote the article migration, it'll create those stubs, and when it runs the media migration, it'll see that there's already a stub created with the ID that matches, and it'll just fill in all the fields for that content. So some reasons that you might, some things that you might hit in that case is that, you know, maybe neither of those works. In that case, you might want to just run migrations multiple times with the update flag. One particular case where I found this to be very helpful is if nodes are referencing other nodes, it might not know what kind of stub to create, and so you might want to just have things run multiple times. And that can kind of, you know, not create stubs when they're not needed, and it just kind of fills stuff in. Yeah, so the last piece of this is that eventually, like, you're going to write your migration and you're going to pass it on, and it's going to be somewhere between like nothing was migrated in automated fashion and everything was, but it's never going to hit that everything. So a thing that we found valuable is to tag content as we're migrating it, and to create a vocabulary for that purpose. So we create a vocabulary, create a field on all the content types that we're migrating, and then as we're processing those entities, identify things like this has embedded HTML, or this has an image, or this has a link that's an absolute link. And these are flags that people can come back to as they're doing content editing and kind of filter all their content and then say like, oh, I need to review this in a hand-by-hand manner. Yeah, so that is it for now. Hopefully I've left enough time for comments. again, my name's Dan Montgomery, and I wanted to kind of open it up to questions. Thank you.
One quick question I have is there a good resource online where you can find examples of, because I know you did a lot of high level, but if there's some examples of how do you write the code for migrating from 7 to 8?
Yeah, I would recommend, I think there are a lot of good blog posts. So there's some information, I think on Drupal.org. A lot of the references I mentioned are kind of like API documentation. So it's like you have a list of the plugins and then you would kind of look at specific things. A lot of the Drupal 7 migrations also have documentation within the within those migration files. So they provide an example of like, here's a very basic version or representative version of doing like this type of migration, and you can usually just copy those over and then change some things that apply to you. I don't have, nothing's jumping out like for that particular purpose, but I think there is a lot of stuff around that specific topic. Cool, Mike.
So when you have the node migration, then you need to create a media migration. You have media. What's your process for figuring out how many different migrations you need? And then part of that is if you have to do estimations for like how long a migration is going to take you to build, how do you work through that process?
Yeah, migrations are really tricky for the estimation process. I think for the number of entities, it kind of comes down to like, yeah, it really depends. I think there is a lot of similarity between projects, but some of the things is like you're splitting apart content types or combining things. There might be tricky ways that you can like write one migration that dynamically handles a bunch of things at once, or just like split them up to keep things a little bit easier to read. I think there is some like figuring what works for you and iterating on it. In terms of the estimation, I think on projects like there's typically a budget that's associated with migration, and you can give like a high level. These are the primary content types based on, this is the quantity of them and the complexity of them that you want to allocate to migration. And I think there's just a lot of discussion that has to happen of like, okay, if we were to spend more effort, like what are we going to get the benefit from, and making sure that that works with the clients that you have. So that's not like a great answer, but it is definitely one where it's a very different thing from like Drupal development. And so I think there is a lot of communication that has to happen with the content editors who might not be the people you're normally talking to on a project. Yeah.
I have a blog post that kind of talks about that.
Cool.
How the managers wrote, so come find me if you wanted to read it or you were pointed to it.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you ever run across a scenario where your BCAT tests are looking at the actual database content, but the Drupal formats are filtering it out, so you're getting the same result? Do you use that taxonomy that you talked about to flag those, or how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So like as a developer at this stage of the process, we're interested in like the value came across, but yes, it is really good to kind of work with the content team and let them know that what's presented on the page passes through like several other stages. And so you might think that all your content got deleted, but you need to look at like the source code or something like that. So I think, I might have missed your question, but I think the thing that I would recommend doing is just kind of working with that team. And as they identify examples for you to work with, like they might provide examples that you're then using and they're expecting to see things. So as long as you have that like shared set of examples and show them like this is how to look, this is how to verify it on your end, because they're probably not going to run those automated migrations. Although you could show that as part of a demo, and clients usually like to see things that they don't necessarily understand, but they kind of see the things working and they're like, oh, that's cool. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think he was, sorry.
Yeah.
You were asking if the hack test itself is testing for like live content.
Yeah,
that might have changed. So I think the answer to that is.
The answer for the ones that I use is no, but you could definitely do it. So those are just like the standard Drupal Behat libraries will test for the what's presented on the page. So if you want to test for those as well, I think those would be good tests. But yeah, in this case, because maybe you're doing it before all that work's been done, or because there's all that other stuff. Yeah, I think it's just something to keep in mind. Probably. All right, I think we're at the time, but I'm also around and, happy to answer questions and stuff. So, yeah, thanks everyone.